Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tractable. I'm Shatej, co-founder and CTO here at Orb. Today, I have with me Uma, who's the VP of Engineering at Render. Render is a platform that helps you build, deploy, and scale applications across a broad range of technical stacks and services. Render is used by companies like Equal, README, Felt, and a ton of other startups. So, to give Uma a little bit of an introduction, Uma has a ton of experience in runtime environments, previously helped to scale internal compute and runtime at Stripe in a period of growth for the company, both in terms of usage and headcount. So lots and lots of experience to draw on. Really excited to have Uma here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, maybe before we dive into technical details, which I'm sure will be the meat of our conversation, tell me a little bit about Render today. Obviously, you spend a lot of time on the engineering side, but if we just talk about the core thesis of the company, how would you frame that?
The core thesis is really what you touched on. We're trying to be a modern cloud for developers. So, it's like we're going to be the cloud for developers and then the right question is, wait, how is that different from what already exists? And the key here is we want to abstract away everything that developers don't want to worry about and focus on the core development experience. So all the underlying infrastructure, all the undifferentiated toil, we take that away. We want to provide a true platform as a service. So that's the core value of Render.
Yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of the inspiration for that thesis, at least in your journey, comes from having seen, companies like Stripe or, previous experiences where engineers did have to endure a lot of toil, and then, inevitably companies will spin up internal platform teams that focus on that and try to abstract away parts of the maybe build process or deployment process or even debugging process from them. Are there specific things where you feel like Render does a really good job, or even just specific pain points where you feel like that toil continues to show up and there's an opportunity to really get at it?
Yeah, the core thesis, the way I think of it, is what developers want is a workflow versus what cloud providers provide are resources. So
Mm,
we're bridging that key gap between
right,
what cloud providers are providing is like, here's compute, here's data, here's storage, networking, go build something with it. But what
right,
developers want is a workflow that they want to be able to bring their GitHub account and push it and have
yeah,
it live. And so we're abstracting that away. So what the key difference is we're taking a bunch of resources and making them available as workflows. So the key
right,
workflow that a developer wants and needs. And that's the similarity. So the reason I sort of was excited when I started talking to Render was and I could see that it made sense was after spending time at Stripe and then talking to a bunch of peer companies, it was
mhm,
actually remarkable how much similarity there was in the internal platforms that a bunch of folks had built. So, fast hypergrowth companies building that were cloud native had all essentially developed the same tools and techniques independently. So essentially each
right.
team was building the same thing. And whenever you see these patterns, there's like, okay, there's the clear core product that exists here that can be built.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense to me. I think one of the things I wonder about is there room to continue to kind of push the envelope in how prescriptive you can be as a platform?
Mhm.
Like, in some sense, it's hard to imagine that people don't want point in time recovery of their data,
Mhm.
right? It's just
Yeah.
like something that you kind of have to probably piece together in a lot of systems. It's something you have to kind of build on top of maybe what a cloud provider gives you. Um, are there specific things where you feel like um, these abstractions could be stronger, like just categories of
Mhm.
workflows where you think everyone intuitively feels like, okay, this is the direction we want to head in, but they're having to build that themselves over and over again? Yeah, maybe it would just be interesting to get some examples of that.
Yeah, so some key examples are really how the deployment workflow is so
Mm,
fundamentally different from,
mm,
piecing together compute and storage and a bunch of other things like PR previews, where you are
mm,
able to sort of, iterate on a change at a point in time is so intuitive and something that
right.
we have built at Render but which is very core for the developer experience, but doesn't yet exist at the underlying resource level. So those are a few things. Something that I'm also excited about is anything that's potentially very complex, and
Mm,
things that have potentially paper cuts, where things like permissions or security settings,
right.
or the classic S3 bucket being left exposed to the
Yeah.
internet, like those things where if we provide strong opinionated defaults, but then
Hmm.
but there will always be a category of users that do want to sort of like peek under the hood. So you do want
Yeah.
to allow that sort of backup option. And that's where features like people do want, for instance, the ability to SSH into instances. We provide
Right.
that. But do the vast majority of our users want that? Not necessarily. So I think really strong, opinionated, sane defaults is the way for
Hmm.
the majority, I think, with the option to sort of go another layer and another layer below for power users, basically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think it's a good example, the permissions one, because I feel like that's the sort of thing where if you're a small team and you get dropped into AWS, it's not easy to fall into the successful outcome there, right? It's very easy to misconfigure it or maybe even go the opposite way and add a bunch of process or bottlenecks in your engineering velocity because you're very concerned about it, and sometimes maybe for no good reason, right? You're kind of trying to add security in the spots where it doesn't actually matter. I'm curious, like in developing those opinions, of course, you're taking your background, but how does Render think about building product in an opinionated way? Is that you have to talk to a bunch of companies? Is it's pretty clear what you should build and it's just a matter of execution? Like, I'm wondering,
I think
is
all of
there
the above.
typically ambiguity? Yeah.
I think that it's really all of the above. It almost like depends on the scenario. So for
Hmm.
some things, there's like a lot of deep intuition that the team has built. Like Anurag, Megan, other Megan's our head of product, Anurag is the CEO. They've built a lot of deep intuition. Or there's, in some cases, we have sort of our own experience internally on dealing with this with
Right.
vendors that has sort of taught us. But the key is you always have to, for a startup, as I'm sure you understand, is like we always talk to our users. So
Yeah.
we have many different ways in which we talk to our users. There's a lot of proactive approach. We also actually take on, we have a strong opinion on this, which is potentially a bit different, but we actually take a
Mm.
very sophisticated support view. So our view
Mm.
is that our audience, developers, are actually like, highly sophisticated users. So when they are reaching out to support, they have typically tried a bunch of things themselves. So they want highly technical support. So we have
Yeah.
a highly technical support team that actually helps our users, and they are a extremely good source of insights. I actually often say this, I've said this publicly, but they're actually like our secret resource. We very deliberately hired a team that is extremely hands on, essentially developers themselves. So they
Yeah.
understand developer pain points, and they do a great job of funneling. They're really like truly like advocates for a lot of our users, and they funnel that pain back and
Yeah.
advocate for changes in the product.
Yeah, that's interesting. I imagine having a really tight feedback loop with support is pretty key to improving the product. And it's almost like when someone reaches out to support, there's a lot of value in that conversation, even though I imagine the moment the priority is like, let's just fix whatever production issue there is, and then let's like kind of analyze and retrospect on that conversation to see how we could have made someone feel more comfortable in that situation, understand the system better, kind of whatever the prompt is.
Yeah.
I'm sure you get asked this a lot, and you just referenced this, but it sounds like there is a potential, at least, that cloud providers like AWS want the same thing, right? They want to make their abstractions less complicated, more developer friendly. How do you think this plays out over the medium term? Of course, no one really knows, but I'm curious for your take on, is there a reason why this relationship would stay symbiotic in this way versus having someone like AWS just take their primitives and continue building up the chain?
Yeah, so something that one is, I think it's actually plausible that there's literally no business that you can start that Amazon as a whole, not necessarily AWS, could not
Yeah.
be disrupting, right? So,
Yeah.
for example, at Stripe, it would actually be a frequently asked question at all hands, which is what if Amazon enters the payment space? There is
Right.
actually
Right.
literally no space that they are not capable of entering. So if you take that as the sort of answer or that as a thesis, a lot of startups wouldn't exist, you know. So I
Right.
think
Right.
that's sort of they can and they do enter a lot of spaces. So that being said, it would be naive to sort of not think about, okay, why would they not build in this space? The thesis here is, well, it's certainly a different, and I've lived through this myself, where when you are in the business of providing a highly profitable product that is actually like extremely sticky, which is what the cloud business is already, and it was hugely
Yeah.
disruptive. There actually isn't an immediate need to kind of go up the stack. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one key thing. But then there is a certain DNA that companies need to build. And that is sort of sometimes interestingly, like, it's hard to actually build that in-house. And sometimes that DNA comes from outside. And we've seen this
Yeah.
many times.
Yeah.
For instance, AWS itself should have, in my view, been built by
Yeah.
a company that I used to work at called VMware that actually pioneered virtualization, and they did not.
Right.
So you
Right.
have to actually sometimes be on the other side to build that value add, and that's sort of like the core thing. But I also think that it's again very symbiotic in that there is a value. There's folks that want what Render's providing, and we build on
Right.
top of cloud providers, and there's people that still want to go directly to the cloud provider. Obviously, our hope is that we will continue growing this piece of the pie over time.
Yeah.
But in our thesis is that it's actually a growing pie. And it's actually,
Yeah.
there's a market for the number of things that people want to develop and sort of, host online is only growing. And we want to be part of that growing market. And we think that there's more people that want to be served than are being served by a platform like Render.
Yeah, and it makes sense to me that there's also as you're saying, there's a core competency sort of difference, right? It's possible that the folks who want to go work at AWS are really excited about building something like Dynamo, where you have to think at a very low level, or scaling, something like S3, where again you're thinking about a class of guarantees or problems that are different than the ones you're thinking about at Render, or at least adjacent to, where maybe it is just like a different set of concerns that you're focusing on rather than an engineer at AWS. I'm curious for actually digging into that a little bit. Where is your team spending time today? Like if we break down the team's capacity, what buckets would you put that in terms of maybe which products are they spending time on? And also just, I'm sure there are a set of folks who are thinking purely about reliability and scaling. So how does the team break down?
Yeah, so no, that's a great question. And I think we've actually designed our teams to map to how we sort of, want to think of our investments because, the way to think of your architecture is going to reflect the org is to actually build your org to reflect what you want the
Right.
architecture to be. So we have a pretty strong investment in infrastructure and security. Those are sort of like foundational teams. Security is smaller, but we have a pretty large infrastructure team, and they're the ones that build
Hmm.
the key foundational infrastructure abstractions on top of
Hmm.
cloud providers. And then we have the core product teams, and we can kind of think of them in terms of the user journey. So we have
Hmm.
a team that's sort of like thinking of new users. That's called activation, and that's a very small, nimble team that iterates very quickly on user onboarding and that part of the user journey. And then core, within the product are two teams that focus on basically data stores, which is our managed database products, and
Hmm.
the other rest of the capabilities. So all of the other platform capabilities
Hmm.
that all users of Render will use. So everything that's sort of
Right.
in the product. And then we have another team that focuses on our largest users and sort of
Hmm.
enterprise users. And that's the
Right.
sort of split as we think about it.
That makes sense. One thing that comes to mind when you describe that is, and I think just even in the way that you frame the first team versus the others, how do you think about like risk tolerance
Mhm.
differently across the stack, right? So I imagine There are some teams where you have to be,
Yep.
maybe security is an example, but even some of these core infrastructure
Mhm.
teams, you kind of, the cost of a mistake is very high.
Yep.
Whereas, no one wants a bug in the UI, especially if you're a developer experience company. But in some sense, it is less costly than a
Yep.
correctness bug in the core layer. So, is that something that has changed over time, or yeah, like how do you message that internally, the risk
Mhm.
tolerance piece?
I think that's actually something that has changed many times almost, and is almost. I think it's a bit almost like the weather, where it actually changes a bit based on many different things. And the reason I say it's like the weather in that there's actually things outside of our control that affect risk
Mm,
tolerance. So, as an example, over a year ago, we had this external event where a competitor was going through some struggles, and then they also announced the end of their free tier. And we
mm,
had a huge influx of new users,
hmm.
and the platform was like really creaking on the edges. So we sort of looked at it and we took a okay, no more. We for the next sort of like 4 weeks, no risky changes. Everyone is going to be like super. All we're going to do is like fix things that are breaking, and sort of so it is a bit dependent on many different things, but in a steady state the way we think about it is sort of like almost on the change itself. So the idea is that even on infra there are many like safe and easy to roll changes, and we try to push the decision making to the individual engineers as much as possible, and speed
Yeah,
is always a premium. So the idea is that if it's a low risk change, you sort of use your standard process and roll it. If it's a high risk change, example, a large migration, then you have to be like really careful about it.
yeah,
And something that we do is when we have incidents, we talk about them. And the idea is
right.
that sort of folds back into the learning and the
Yeah.
growing of the organization.
Are there specific technical decisions you think in the process of building the platform today that have given you a lot of mileage in terms of de-risking future changes? Is there an abstraction layer, or even it could even just be a process that you have instilled that has made people more confident with changes that would otherwise feel like really risky?
I think there's some changes that we've made, which is sort of very deliberately investing in a lot of understanding of infrastructure, which has been a journey. But I
Mm,
would say that the team is very deeply understands infrastructure to a point where they are able to unpack things much more quickly than even like some of the cloud providers. So that's been like a core investment. And then I
mhm,
think other key decisions have been to sort of when we have like deviated from like sort of like the good architectural path, to then sort of invest in bringing it back into the fold, which has allowed people to move faster. So that's actually publicly we've talked about it in our blog. For example, we launched a free tier uh,
mhm,
2.5 years ago, and it was launched very quickly. And then over time, we realized that was a source of rough edges, because it was a
mhm.
separate sort of almost like a fork. So there was a conscious decision made to bring it back in. So trying to sort of prevent very custom or like separate instances as a very
Right,
deliberate design decision has been like a key thing, where the closer you keep all of your code base to not being like unique forks, that's a key
right.
one. But I would say that we're still very much a work in progress in this. So something that we're actually investing in right now is we found that the sort of like development, our own developer workflow, like CI and
Mhm,
end-to-end tests, have basically accumulated tech debt over the last few years, and we're actually going
right,
through. We then decided, okay, that's slowing us down. So we're actually investing. A couple of people are actually taking time right now to essentially redo it, and we're actually
mm,
moving off an older CI system to GitHub Actions currently. So, and the idea is
got
that
it.
making those key investments is maybe the most conscious thing that we've been doing.
Yeah, and one of the things you said there was not letting the code base diverge too much so that you're not managing multiple mental models of the world. I imagine one challenge you face is building a platform like Render where you have to service the hobbyists, right?
Mhm.
So a couple people versus much larger companies. I imagine it's easy to let enterprises drive the roadmap. And in
Yeah.
some cases that probably makes sense, right? Like revenue is important. And in fact, it's just important to have feedback from the more mature companies to inform what problems the smaller companies might hit in the future. But on the other hand, you're of course building a platform that should work for these small companies and not make it too complex and not expose them to that level of maturity too early. I'm curious if that resonates and if there's things you do to avoid having larger enterprises kind of dominate the conversation in terms of what investments you make.
No, that's 100% the thing, which is sort of why the team split again. Like
Yeah.
the larger enterprise team is the one. So the idea is that investment then dictates, like, that's the amount of investment we will make. But
Yeah.
that being said, we think of our largest and fastest growing users as sort of being the leading edge. So they're sort of, you know, in many ways where we want to be. And our goal is always to stay ahead of where they are. So
Right.
when they say that, hey, they're running into these things, we're like, oh, that's sort of where we need to
Mm.
be, and we need to be there before them. And that's
Yeah.
enabled by the tight feedback loop. The way we work on that sort of request and that sort of life cycle is essentially keep that tight feedback loop, listen to those requests, and wherever possible, we actually try to build the things that can then be generalized. And so
Hmm.
essentially productizing those features as quickly as possible. So we'll
Right.
actually, build them early based on user
Right.
feedback, but we're able to generally, for the most part, quickly understand, like, hey, is this something that applies only to this user, or is it that they are the first ones asking for it and
Hmm.
many
Hmm.
others are soon going to be able to use it? And as long as it is something that can be generalized for like all of our users, we tend to actually build it and then productionize it. And the interesting thing we found is users actually typically want, when they want a feature, they want it to be like the GA version of the feature. Most users
Right.
don't
Right.
want to be on the bleeding edge of the platform, right? So that is typically, that actually
Mm.
works both ways. As long as we're okay, this is something that makes sense for probably all users are going to need this in 3 months, 6 months. They're just the first ones to ask it. We build it, productionize it. We do have what we call early access,
Mm.
where we do opt in some of these users into it early, but
Right.
most of them actually will say that they want to wait for GA.
The GA version, yeah. And actually, I imagine that the thing that becomes tempting as a result of that is to continue expanding the product suite, right? There's a lot of services you already offer, and a lot more you could. Um, One, I'm curious, like in general, how do you define the boundaries of the product? And I think part of the answer must be what you said earlier, which is you give escape hatches and you don't
Mhm.
try to productize everything. But in the kind of horizontal way, you still have to manage the boundaries. And maybe as a part of that, how do you think about build versus buy as an internal decision, right? Where there are certain products that you can quote unquote wrap, and certain products that you will want to build. What is the
Well,
distinction there?
this is like a great question because I spent a lot of time thinking about it. So, one of the key grounding things is what's part of the core developer experience for us. And the thing that has evolved is develop individual developers to teams is a core part
Hmm.
for us. And that's what we are optimizing for this, for the developer experience for individuals and teams. And then we have these
Hmm.
personas internally. And whatever makes sense for that core developer experience, we will build
Hmm.
ourselves. Now, there can be a difference though. There's some things that are operationally hard to build, and then there's things that are operationally hard to manage. So, an
Hmm.
exam, and some fall into both buckets,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, an example of something that is operationally hard to both build and manage is something that's like, very deep infrastructure heavy.
Hmm.
And so an example of, if that falls into a core developer experience, that is, developers think of it as a fundamental thing that they want, then we build
Hmm.
it. So data stores like managed databases is a good example of that. Hard to
Yeah.
build and hard to manage, but it's something that developers will absolutely want as part of the core developer experience. Like if you're building an app, you likely have data you want to store somewhere.
Right.
So that's part of it. So the idea is, okay, we will build it. And then depending on how, and then it's like sort of how we will build it, that sort of is like whether we will wrap it on an external thing or but like still manage it ourselves, or will we offer a plugin? So if it's not part of the
Yeah.
core developer experience, then tend to sort of take the more buy experience where it's something that people
Mm.
want, but not something that we want to develop core competency in. That's something like becoming like a CDN, or
Right.
preventing DDoS attacks, and that's where we use Cloudflare, and we're pretty open about the fact that we use them. So that's like something you absolutely, if you're hosting something on the web, you absolutely want it to stay up and not be DDoSed. But it's not something that we as a company want to become experts in. So that's
Yeah.
sort of like the build versus buy. And then there's another category which is purely like internal tools, right?
Right.
So those I strongly believe, unless it's something that's like really fundamental, and particularly if it's not load bearing, we tend to buy. So things
Yeah.
like buy or use open source versions like CI, or instant management tools, many other
Right.
things.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It almost sounds like the more you can kind of separate it from the rest of the workflow, it makes sense to kind of build, or sorry, to buy something like DDoS. Whereas the closer it is and the more it has to fit together with the rest of the workflow, you don't want it to be a disjointed experience, right? And so then
Exactly.
you do need to think about it as a single unit. So I think in the process of, whether it's building these or wrapping them, regardless, you serve a lot of web traffic. And so render, as a result, cannot be a cheap product to run. And also, there's a lot of different use cases you're serving. Some are very mission critical, and some maybe are less so. But either way, I think you're incurring costs there. So, how do you think about the cloud economic story? And how do you structure your pricing and packaging, or even just think about internal margins, regardless of what the public pricing is?
Yeah, it's such a great topic, and one that no one would have asked like in 3 years
In
ago, right?
2020.
2020, who margins, what's that? And then now in this current era, margins is what everyone talks about. So it's actually both a really interesting problem, but also an opportunity. So sort of the same way as we talk about undifferentiated toil, and when you amortize that undifferentiated toil across the board, you can think of cloud economics as the same way.
Hmm.
It's much more cost efficient for us to be managing all of these resources on behalf of our users, instead of
Mm,
each of these users trying to negotiate individually
interesting.
with each of the providers, right? Because cloud providers are very incentivized to have volume discounts. Similar, and
Right.
like we're talking about like packaging up a huge amount of that. And the same way on the technical side, it's much simpler, or at least there's you can actually have develop a strategy when you are dealing with a volume uh, level of usage, and you can
Yeah.
sort of build ways to kind of essentially optimize that. And that's what we've basically spent. We've spent a year and a half at this point developing this, so there's a lot of ways in which, particularly at high volumes, and all of our compute and data and network usage is extremely high volume,
Right.
and this is what our infrastructure team has basically spent time doing, where they have really optimized the usage of these resources. So, for
Yeah.
everything you use, it isn't as simple as, oh, it isn't, it's very much not a binary decision.
Right.
It's about,
Right.
it's a bunch of like architecting. And
Yeah.
this is sort of, this is again the thing that where we actually made a decision that we would become the experts on this versus working with someone else, and or like, even tooling doesn't actually fully
Yeah.
satisfy. So where we are at this point is we deeply understand how usage works
Yeah.
underneath. And so we are able to very strategically optimize that usage. Just like very simple
Yeah.
examples, like how should traffic be routed between regions? Like,
Right.
or like, where does it make sense to send data? Where does it make sense to store data? And,
Yeah.
what's like local versus being sort of offloaded to something like Glacier. We are able to make all of those decisions at scale for each of our vendors. And so that over time adds up to significant margins.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. And it also sounds like this is a very hard problem for you to not internalize because it
Yeah.
affects how you ultimately build the technical infrastructure, right? It's not a afterthought or like a
Mhm.
side effect. It is pretty core to the way data flows, and maybe even in some cases the sort of performance, latency, like even consistency guarantees you can offer as a product on top of that. It's also really interesting you talk about this idea of because you're managing so many different tenants, you get to then run that optimization problem in a way that a single tenant couldn't, right? And they maybe not in a position to go to their cloud provider and say, hey, we need a volume discount, whereas render is, right?
Yeah.
So maybe the other thing that's interesting to explore is this idea of, startups, big or small, trusting you on the reliability front in
Mhm.
this mission critical workload. How do you think about, I want to say the pressure that comes with that, but maybe not even the stress or pressure, just in general, the responsibility of running all of these websites is that I know as you just said, you have a team staffed around that. But in general, is this like a problem where when you're in these conversations on the go to market side, it's confidence building? Is it like showing people, hey, here's how the technical architecture is built? Like how do you navigate those conversations with
Yeah.
companies?
No, this is again, I think, so important, right? It's like when you're a platform, really, you're selling a lot of different things, but
Yeah.
a core thing you're selling is peace of mind, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's something we talk about a lot internally. We do, it depends on our users. Some users want to get into the nitty gritty of how, but really, what we have found is what people want is for us to show what we show the work, not talk
Yeah.
about it, right? It doesn't matter
Right.
how well you're doing if if the nines aren't there, basically,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
And so that's really what matters in the end, which is how resilient are we, how well do we respond, how well do we take responsibility for when we do sort of have an incident. And
Yeah.
we have a very high degree of rigor around this. So
Right.
we're pretty proud of our stability and resilience at this point. So it wasn't
Yeah.
always the case. It's taken a long time to get here, right? But
Yeah.
it's always a work in progress. Like this is the kind of thing where you have to constantly invest in to stay ahead of the curve. Because again,
Yeah.
it's like everything you're building and every new sets of user kind of like starts stress testing it, and then the more things you add, the more your underlying provider, for example, can also have their own issues, and those start.
Right.
Important framing that I do think is important, especially for like say smaller users, is we're building this and we're going to be as reliable as possible. And in many ways, it's not that it, I think of it a bit like a sense of control around. There's a sort of word that I'm forgetting, but like people feel less safe flying planes versus
Right.
driving. And that's sort of a bit of education, right? Like you're not going to have fewer incidents if you're running it
Yeah.
yourself. It's just that you might feel more confident because you're in control.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's we had to sort of message that, but then also make sure our reliability is completely top notch.
And this is probably where this idea of having a very technical support team comes in play, right? Because if there is an incident and they reach out and they're talking to your support team, it's a big, the job of support, of course, is to fix the issue, but also to instill the confidence that, like, hey, we're on it. We understand what the issue is. We can help you navigate this issue. And I have to imagine for a company that's 3 or 4 or 10 people, that can be a scary moment, which is, hey, if none of us can figure it out, like we need to lean on someone else for the expertise.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's always a conversation that you need to have
Yeah.
internally.
And
Yeah.
oversharing, honestly, like we just never take our users for granted, right? A
Yeah.
key thing is just sort of, like our users are basically people like us, and we never take them for granted. And we always imagine that they're having the conversations that we would have in their situation. So always being upfront and transparent, like pretty much
Yeah.
for every like critical incident for above a certain degree, we actually like publish RCAs. So those are
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
we take a very much of like communicate as much as possible and
Yeah.
share upfront. And the idea is that by being transparent and communicating, users can sort of join us in that journey.
Yeah. One thing I'm curious about is how does that level of transparency translate to internal team culture, right? Because I imagine from a business standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. That being said, if I'm an engineer at Render and I'm thinking like, if I mess this up, this might end up in a blog post where we have to share it from
Mhm.
the transparency angle. Do you feel like people get nervous about that, or do you think there's a lot of buy-in that, hey, this is the responsibility of
I
working
think
on
it's
such a critical problem?
transparency. It's transparency, but not blame, right? I think that's
Yeah,
the key. So it's like, incidents are 100% blameless, right? Like in the incident, the
yeah,
first goal is resolve the thing, not blame.
yeah, yeah,
It's never like, we never even like, for instance, reference who pushed the PR. It's always
right,
like how are we rolling back? How are we getting to a good state? And the same
yeah,
thing in debriefs. So after any major incident, we have a debrief. So it's always it. I think it's people sometimes equate transparency with like finger pointing, and that's the opposite. Like
right,
it's always like where so there's never an element of blame. I think there's always again the responsibility and transparency, but never oh why did X do so and so. It was just like oh the system allowed us to do this and how do we fix
right.
the system to get better.
Yeah. So, I mean, suppose there's a production incident. I imagine, as an engineering leader, there's always a temptation to get into the weeds and fix the thing. And then I'm sure there's a voice in the back of your head that says, like, look, I just need to trust the team to go and fix this. Like, what is your role in production incidents these days? How often are you all hands on deck, like digging into the technical issue versus maybe doing customer comms or helping organize the team around it?
I think the key learning that I actually had prior to render at Stripe is leaders being in the weeds honestly is almost always like a distraction to the actual
Yeah.
incident, right? This is the culture which I was very grateful to learn. Was the idea was let the people fixing things fix it because that's the
Yeah.
fastest path to resolution. Really, that's just in everyone's best interest. What leaders can do is comms and sort of traffic routing.
Yeah.
And that's how I see my role as well as that of engineering managers. So traffic routing and kind of being calm and making sure that the team has what it needs. So
Hmm.
in the kind of incident where you have to like have a plan A and a plan B and a plan C, that's something that I or another senior person might do in an incident, but or and that's what the team knows to rely on us for, and they know to like if it's hey can we ask the user X versus Y, then I can like weigh in on that or comms or like reviewing stuff. But that very
Yeah.
much is the right way. Or I might ask questions like hey should we page in others or things that
Right.
sometimes in the heat of the moment people get tunnel vision, and so or they might be hesitant to say like hey should we. So that's
Yeah.
sort of that's the role of a good incident commander, and that's how I
Yeah.
sort of see my role and that of others. Like you
Yeah.
don't sort of just
Okay.
like wait on the sidelines. That's a key distinction. You do want to be
Yeah.
involved if it's particularly bad, but in a way that's actively helpful and not just sort of running around yelling at people.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Not just causing more panic when
Exactly.
people are already stressed. One thing I'm curious about, is there a technical decision that, if you look back on it, that you made, or improvement that you made that reduced the rate of incidents? I mean, obviously, in general, the trend line is the platform gets more and more stable. But was there like a step jump where you're like, oh, we, switch from this strategy to this other strategy, or this service to this other service that really helped us?
I think multiple ones. The one I referenced a while ago, like just earlier today, around the sort of re-architecting free tier, and that's actually on our
Mm,
blog. That was a big one. The decision. So there's like multiple sort of key things that I can think of. The free tier one was a big one because it was causing a lot of internal instability until
right.
basically a couple of engineers were like, "It's time. We're going to do it," and just like went and did it. And one of them is the author on that blog. Another couple of sort of like step differences was like in the summer of 2020, we had like a really bad incident, multiple hours. And then after that, we basically staffed a bunch of work to do,
Mm,
to essentially re-architect our
mm,
underlying clusters in a particular, in a much more resilient way and redo a bunch of things. And we basically spent a couple of months cleaning up. And that I
mm,
think again showed like a step function difference. And what we try to
mm.
also do consciously is things that we learn from them, then how do we sort of like incrementally make them better? So
Yeah.
there, that one was another key decision. And then a key decision, in addition, that was sort of like a technical decision in this case to go with a particular vendor was okay. We did, for a while we were actually like trying to build the muscle ourselves to deal with DDoS attacks,
Hmm.
and then we decided actually this isn't the right use of engineering time, and we're going
Hmm.
to put ourselves behind a vendor, and then we and that was actually a core investment. So it isn't like a drop in replacement. You don't just like buy
Right.
buy something and just drop it in, right? So, but that was again a core investment where that again had a certain class of incidents. I think of these as where a certain class of like this investment led to a class of incidents. So these three are
Yeah.
sort of like key examples in
Yeah.
this.
That makes sense. It sounds like one common pattern or thread between those is the incremental improvements weren't really working, and so you had to kind of zoom out. Maybe there's some thrash to saying, okay, we're gonna stop here and we're going to just take a completely different approach that might mean 2 3 months of pain, but
Yeah.
it's going to pay off at the end. And ultimately that's a bet you make, right? And
Yep.
I'm sure it doesn't always pay off, but it is the sort of thing you have to be willing to do, or at least make a bet on in the leadership position where
Yep.
I'm sure like other people are not confident enough to say, hey, we should back out of our plan,
Yeah.
right?
I think that's key. Though I think in all of these cases, it was not like me sort of, sort of joining a Zoom and saying we're doing X, right? It was always a
Right.
much more like the process to come to the decision was always a much more, data gathering, for
Mm,
instance. And actually, the free tier change was actually completely engineering driven
mm,
because they were feeling the biggest pain, and
right.
they were just like, we're just going to make this change, like re-architect this, and then it'll get rid of. So the reason I think those three examples are sort of different because each one actually had a very different decision making
I see.
process. One
I
was
see.
actually like engineers saying, no, this is too much. Like, we just have to rewrite this whole thing. And really, my decision in that case was really just to say, okay, like, yes,
Yeah.
please do it. In the DDoS protection, there it was okay. There was actually like a pretty in depth investigation on even like picking the vendor and how we would integrate and similar. And in the different incident, that was actually a series of actually prioritization efforts almost that
Mm,
we made between myself and different parts of the engineering team. So each one was
got it.
almost like a different engineering process, but I think the common theme is deciding, sort of like reaching that point where it was okay, something different has to be done here,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
working backwards to a solution from that.
Yeah. That makes sense. Okay, sweet. Well, maybe last thing I wanted to ask you is what's coming next? Like, what are you most excited about? It could be a product launch, it could be, a technical release, but what's next for Render? And personally, what are you most excited about?
Yeah, I'm really excited about a bunch of different features that are coming up. And what we've seen, and I'm sure again, everyone is probably like, very well aware, like, more and more AI applications are being built. So
Yeah.
what we have started seeing is a difference in the requests we're getting to
Mm,
support them. So while it's like, and the surprising thing is that it's less things like GPUs, and more things like vectorized databases or
mm,
object store or similar things. And I'm actually very excited that a few of our teams are building features. So something like vectorized databases actually was already launched last year. PG Vector has a plugin. So I was very excited about that. And now what I'm excited coming up is we just kicked off building object storage. And that's
okay.
something where we'll actually be building object storage into the render platform. And that's one of those, again, nice, big, meaty features that a lot of our users
Yeah.
have been asking for a very long time.
Yeah.
And that's, something that is, again, core and very complex to build, but very exciting to be able to offer our users. I think that's actually like a key sort of differentiator, that sort of feature for us.
Awesome. Well, that sounds very exciting. And thank you again for your time and coming on the show. Yeah, appreciate it.
It was great chatting, Shitish. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course.